Science. Knowledge, or a system of knowledge covering general truths or the operation of general laws, especially as obtained and tested through scientific method. Today, we are going to be discovering how deep people are willing to go. Some for the sake of science, some under its guise. These are the experiments that we would like to forget. These are just some of the darkest experiments in human history. Love, affection, and care. Humans need these ingredients for a happy life, and unfortunately, that has to be proven with results over and over again. Our first experiment begins with another in the heart of America, Madison, Wisconsin. Harry Harlow had been hard at work in the Madison University lab with his experiments on rhesus monkeys. Harry, for some time at this point, had been working on the study of love in the early stages of life, mostly centered around the idea of early touch and affection given to children by their mother. Harry's first experiment many know of is the cloth and wire mother experiment. Harry had several monkeys separated from birth from their mother. They would then be put in an enclosement with two options. Harry and his team made makeshift surrogates out of cloth for some, and others were made of wire and metal. They both provided food for the subject through the use of a bottle. While the cloth mother provided warmth and comfort, the wire mother simply didn't. Other tests were run during the experiment, one of them being a fear test for the monkeys. They would be put in an enclosure. Then, the scientist would present a toy bear that, once wound up, would beat on a tiny toy drum. When their mother was around, the monkeys would use this opportunity to investigate the toy. If they ever felt fear, they could run back to mother, and she would provide the close touch they needed to calm themselves. However, when the cloth or wire mother were not present, the monkeys would cower, clutching themselves in fear. The team devised that the soft contact touch of the mother was the most ideal and would allow for children the safety they needed, which by modern day sensibilities might seem absurd to think that wasn't obvious. However, at the time of these experiments in the late 50s and early 60s, it wasn't. Sigmund Freud and other popular psychologists at the time were mostly to blame for this new wave of parenting that Harlow was attempting to disprove. Some hospitals had adopted the practice of, after the birth of the child, separating them from the parent because the belief was that it would mentally ruin your child to show affection at such an early stage. If you were to touch your child, its future would suffer. The belief at the time was that early affection can lead to abandonment issues, affection issues, and other psychological damage that would manifest in the child's future relationships. Harlow disproved much of this, and all by simply showing his monkeys and the love they showcased for their surrogate wire and cloth mothers. The science of love was what Harlow prided himself in, referring to it always as the science of love and not as proximity, as many academics, scientists, and researchers were prone to call it in a professional setting. An event in his life would alter this path and lead to the pit of despair. Harlow had been experimenting with love and how it affected us. how it gave us an essential component for life. Harlow began to tinker with the idea about the opposite. He began to experiment with loss. In 1968, when depression fell over Harlow, he went to a Mayo clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, and stayed there for 2 months. He went through electroshock treatment to cure himself of his depression, but it seems it would linger with him even when he would come back to the Wisconsin lab. This would prompt one of the more unethical experiments in modern time. Harlow would begin to create a model of depression that he could study.
Now, in this experiment, this is the apparatus we use. That looks diabolical. That's just the way the baby monkey feels about it.
His first attempts at creating loss for the subjects was to induce isolation from birth. Subjects were put through different time periods of isolation, 1 month all the way to a year. They were placed inside a box with a one-way window to allow the researchers to observe the subject. Everything else was left blank. The only contact was when researchers reached in to feed them. All subjects came out of this experiment, unfortunately, completely disturbed. When the year-long subjects came out, they would be attacked by the other more socialized monkeys, provoking attacks from them. The researchers would sometimes have to again isolate them in hopes of recovery. Worse yet, Harlow and the team realized that these isolated monkeys could no longer have normal sexual relationships with the other monkeys. The team devised a way for the isolated female subjects to give birth by forced insemination from the socialized monkeys. This was done through a table the isolated females were strapped to. These mothers would go on to become abusive, hurting their children, and even getting to the point of one monkey mother reportedly holding down and chewing off an offspring's foot. Even with these disturbing events and experiments, Harlow was not satisfied. He needed more results. Isolation wasn't the only characteristic of depression. Harlow realized that loss and hopelessness were essential ingredients to this, and they could be achieved through recreated means. The pit of despair, as it was coined by Harlow himself, was set in motion. Harlow originally wanted to go with the name, the Dungeon of Despair, but his students and colleagues warned against this name. Pit was a much more apt title because the subjects would plunge into a literal physical pit they could never imagine, falling deeper and deeper into despair day by day. The contraption Harlow had devised was extremely simple and extremely effective. It resembled an upside-down pyramid. At the top is a wire grate. The subject can see out of this, yet it must try to maintain itself at the top if it wishes to do so. The monkeys will continue to try again to get a view, to smell the fresh air, to escape. They can't, however, and eventually they won't even try. These monkeys will slowly give up over the course of 6 weeks. Then the test will be over. The subjects would all be part of a social group before the experiment would ever be conducted. These monkeys were social. They had friends, families, and shared community together with other monkeys. They would be forced to lose this. They would be forced to give up hope. Harlow truly created a model of depression, taking a monkey who had previously been social and had been given a good life, then having them placed inside the pit for an extended period of time would create loss in anyone. This device would be inspired from his own depression. He felt as if it resembled what he had felt. A pit where you could not escape from. The subjects, after all of this isolation, no matter the background, wire mother, cloth mother, socialized, unsocialized, they would all come out disturbed. They would attempt self-starvation and not interact with other monkeys afterwards. All of these experiments would come to full circle once they began to rehabilitate the subjects. Harlow would truly prove that love wins all. The key to rehabilitation of the disturbed pit of despair subjects comes in the form of touch. Harlow and his team would slowly start to have the subjects begin to interact with the youngest monkeys, the babies. An isolated subject and a baby would be placed in a glass observation cage and would slowly begin to become friends and socially active. The babies would tentatively watch the isolated subjects and come closer to them, and the isolated subjects would begin to respond more and more positively to this behavior. For some, it would take no time at all, but for others, it would take multiple sessions of this, yet eventually they would all return to normal. The babies would tentatively watch the isolated subjects and come closer to them, and the isolated subjects would begin to respond more and more positively to this behavior. For some, it would take no time at all, but for others, it would take multiple sessions of this, yet eventually they would all return to normal. This experiment can be best closed out with an opinion by researcher Stephen Suomi, Harlow's right-hand researcher, was that not everyone was terribly affected by these experiments. It took us a while to see it, but quite frankly, the vertical chamber experiments led us to recognize that individual variation matters, that it's not just background noise. These subjects, at the end of the day, all wanted to get better. We all go through things differently, yet they all pulled through. Everyone is different. The study of medicine has been a centuries-old practice. Most of us take for granted when we reach into our cabinet to pull out Tylenol or maybe some cold or cough medicine. The compounds in these have been over many years studied, researched, and tested in the field. What happens when new medicine must be tested, however? The University of California, Los Angeles would unfortunately go into untested waters with an experiment that would end someone's life. Schizophrenia, a mental disorder that is largely characterized by episodes of psychosis, hallucinations, and delusions, including hearing voices and hallucinations. This disorder is still largely unknown as to what causes it, and even now we still have no real treatment that can make the symptoms completely dissipate. Unfortunately, it is still an ongoing battle on how to help those who suffer with schizophrenia. In the 80s, researchers at UCLA wanted to go through a trial run to possibly come up with a treatment option in the form of a drug. The best way they thought to conduct this experiment was to gather a group of people who suffered from schizophrenia and give them this drug. But the end goal was not to truly see if the drug worked, but to see if they could wean the subjects off of it completely, but continue to have the positive effects of the drug take hold in their lives. This idea was unfortunately flawed from the beginning. Greg Aller worried his parents. He told them he had been talking to aliens. Greg would begin to hear voices, and they told him that he was to kill former US President George Bush, and that he would become Speaker of the House after doing so. He began to travel to cemeteries and would recall how the aliens told him to touch the gravestones. He would make contact with his deceased grandmother and have visions of her in his parents' house. Greg began to believe he was being followed by a sniper, watching him from afar, ready to take his shot. This would frighten Greg's parents. They wanted to get him help. This would entangle Greg into a drug trial that would slowly worsen his condition more than ever. Schizophrenia is a condition that has somewhat mystified the medical community for some time. Many studies have emerged on new ways to treat the illness, but seemingly no end in sight for a cure to stop it for good. It seems some healthcare providers recommend the use of second-generation antipsychotics and other treatment options to help tamper many of the symptoms that occur to an individual who may suffer from schizophrenia. Greg Aller would find himself in a very early research trial in one of the first-generation antipsychotic medications. The subjects of this study would go on to sign waivers when they would begin that would later be argued in court about how they had been dishonest from the start. The waivers would state, "My condition may improve, worsen, or remain unchanged. Also, I may benefit from this study by being taken off medication in a careful way while under close medical supervision." The Aller family would go on to argue in court later that this statement was untrue and that their son was treated unjustly in his treatment. Typically now in a study of this nature, if a subject begins to show signs of relapse, the research team might intervene by allowing a smaller dosage of the antipsychotic drug to be used to perhaps make the symptoms regress, or in a worst-case scenario, be agitated, in which a regular dosage would be administered. None of the subjects would receive this safety net. 1989 would be the first year of the drug trial, which would go great. Greg would return to a much more normal living state. He received a 3.8 grade point average at UCSB, the college he was attending. His parents began to worry less, and things seemed to be sliding back into a much more pleasant state of being for Greg. Then, in 1990, a horrible spiral would begin for him. The trial would take him off his Prolixin dosage and replace it with a placebo. He would begin to relapse deeply. He began to see aliens again. In the middle of January of that year, Greg would threaten his mother with a knife. He reported later he wanted to scare the devil out of her. By the end of that month, he would be moving out of his parents, kicked out for being a threat in his current condition. Aller would be noted by one of the researchers, "Moved out of parents, no symptoms present, finishing the semester." Greg was flunking out of college. Greg would begin to hear and see the aliens more. He received news that Bush was going to launch a nuclear missile at Russia to confuse the aliens. He rushed to warn him on the payphone and never got through. May 1990, Bob Aller would visit his son at a motel and try to convince him to get help and to get back on his medication. That night, the aliens would tell Greg that his dad was dead, and he would be commanded to drink out of his hotel toilet. Seeing his dad the next morning alive would snap Aller out of this and would convince him to get help. This would end Aller's story, going through so much progress to only regress so much and at no fault of his own. However, Aller would at least leave with his life. Before we move on from this section, this experiment would unfortunately result in one tragic death. Tony LaMadrid. Tony would reportedly fall off a 9-story building. It was of his own accord, investigators believed. This was due to the same reason as Aller's collapse, after being taken off the drug. This would prompt the entire experiment to be investigated further, which would lead to the trial with the Allers and the brothers of LaMadrid. When a new promising treatment arrives, how do we test such theories? Where is the line drawn? Most experiments and clinical trials of this nature inevitably are going to cause some damage whenever they involve a human or animal subject. How do we know morally when we have gone too far? Our next experiment would cross the line knowingly and justify it under the idea of the greater good. Our next failed experiment is going to be the many atrocities committed in Unit 731. Before the involvement of American forces in World War II, Japan and China had already been battling for some time, beginning in the early 1930s. This conflict would have Japan slowly making its way across mainland China in an attempt to claim more land and resources for the island country. Japan would soon occupy Manchuria, a section of northeastern China, that they would turn into a small state that was controlled from afar by mainland Japan. This would become the base of operations for our next unfortunate experiment, or rather, experiments. We won't be covering everything that happened during the short stint that Unit 731 was open. However, we will try to cover a lot of ground and discuss the heinous treatment of their human subjects, or as the Japanese medics referred to them as, logs. Little by little, facilities began to pop up around Japanese-occupied Manchuria. These facilities wanted to use the citizens as a no-cost research subject. The idea was to set a facility far away from the prying eyes of mainland Japan and create a place where biological weapons could be tested to maximize their potential of devastating effects on the battlefield. This would be only the beginning of the atrocities cooked up here. It wasn't until 1935 that Unit 731 would come into existence. At the time, a medical officer, Shiro Ishii, was in charge of a facility called Zongma Fortress, a much more toned down first attempt at what would later become Unit 731. Zongma would be closed down after an escape attempt by the prisoners they would use to conduct biological warfare on, and later an attempted bombing of the fortress. Shiro Ishii was granted permission by the Japanese government to build another, larger facility. Unit 731 would be constructed and was a much larger building. This would allow for more experimentation. This would require a bigger cover-up. Eventually, this would lead to the most disturbing piece of slang ever created, sounding innocent until further elaborated on. The subjects would be referred to eventually as logs by the Japanese military. This was to dehumanize the subjects themselves, to refer to them almost as more fuel to the horrible fire that was raging at Unit 731. But also, the official cover-up given to the public was that this was a logging mill. However, much more sinister research was conducted here. Subjects would be tied up to the posts in a field by the facility. They would then have planes drop plague-infested fleas on them. They would be sprayed from above with plague cultures. Some would reportedly have a tank-like vehicle drive up to them and spray them with the poison gas. All in the name of figuring out how to cause the most suffering to the enemy at the time. Japan wanted to try anything to gain an edge in the war, whatever the cost. In an article by the New York Times, a Japanese surgeon from the facility would later justify this by simply stating, "In war, you have to win." Some of the subjects were put in even more unfortunate situations that ultimately had no place being brought into reality. Twisted nightmares that would somehow become real. Only when all of the ingredients fall into place can evil to this scale occur. A Russian mother and daughter were put in a gas chamber to see how long the effects would take and what might happen to an individual during being gassed. Subjects would be given typhoid, syphilis, and other diseases. They would then be vivisected with no anesthesia to see the effects these diseases and viruses had on the human body from an internal perspective. When I picked up the scalpel, that's when he began screaming. A Japanese surgeon would recall many years later. This would only be some of the experiments. The nature of some of the research that would happen here would come from a much less scientific ideology and more of a demented and evil one. Surgeries would occur trying to determine whether someone's left arm could be sewed and used where the right one was. Some had their stomachs removed and their esophagus stapled to their intestines to see the results of such horrifying ideas. Others would simply have weapons used on them to test the effects, being shot in limbs, burning subjects with a flamethrower, seeing how shrapnel might be treated after a grenade was to go off next to a soldier. Even more experiments seemed to test nothing other than how sadistic of creations they could come up with, draining subjects' blood over the course of several days to determine how much blood a person could lose before it becomes fatal. Others would have different blood types transfused to them just to see the results, and they even tried to starve and dehydrate a subject just to see how long a human could last under these conditions. The corpses of the dehydration experiments would weigh 1/5 of the body weight when they began the experiment. Unfortunately, in the same case of Dr. Mengele in Auschwitz, the aptly nicknamed Doctor of Death, who experimented on twins, Unit 731's surgeons and medics would also receive wartime immunity after the fact. A small number of experiments actually did contribute to the medical world, and it's the unfortunate sacrifices of these subjects we should be thankful for, and have after their death have saved so many with their unwilling participation. One of those experiments was Unit 731's experimentation with extreme heat and extreme cold. These frostbite experiments would actually find a new cure for the ailment, realizing that putting the affected limb in water above 100 degrees but not above 122 degrees. These experiments would allow America to consider their options with the Japanese at the end of the war. It was decided to grant immunity and absorb the research instead of condemning it. A cover-up began in the States to hide the atrocities in Manchuria, and the researchers were allowed freedom for the horrors they committed that thankfully will never have to be committed again. However, Unit 731 had one last attempt at fighting the war till the very end. In 1945, Japan was very close to losing the war, and many of the higher in command were knowingly on a march of death. Many citizens were willing to fight as well until they lost everything. Japan began to abandon anything that wasn't part of the mainland. They needed all the resources they could to try to defend from the counterattack they thought was coming. Unit 731 would be sabotaged by soldiers before leaving. Documents would be destroyed and the facility was blown up by explosives. Surgeons and medics fled back to the mainland. Japan had constructed one last-ditch effort to use Unit 731's research before the war was truly lost. Operation Cherry Blossoms at Night. This was a plan in which the last remaining Japanese subs and planes would sneak into California waters. This would get the Japanese forces close enough to spring a kamikaze attack. The planes would be loaded with plague-infested bombs, and the pilots would crash themselves into major places in San Diego. This plan never happened. They didn't have the resources to spare. However, Japan did launch balloons over the ocean with bombs in an attempt to cause damage to US cities. The original idea was to load the bombs up with plagues, crop killers, and livestock diseases in an attempt to ruin America's food sources and cause an outbreak of disease. Over 200 balloons landed in North America, killing 7 US citizens. After this, Shiro Ishii, the medical officer in charge, would receive immunity from the American government. Hideki Tojo, the Japanese prime minister, would be hanged. Many of the field medics and surgeons who have revealed their stories about the horrors of Unit 731 would also receive immunity. The US government would actually absorb much of the information that was done at Unit 731 and Dachau and actually continue some of these experiments. Our next experiment's origins began during this period of wartime experimentation and grew into something much larger over time. And it begins by traveling all the way to one of the most famous American college campuses, Harvard. Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, a man who infamously mailed packages and in some cases hand-delivered them, all of them containing makeshift explosive devices to kill the recipient. Many of the victims were professors and computer store owners. The hope was to spread a message, a warning rather. He wanted, in a backwards way, to spread his idea about the unbridled advancement of technology that continues to this day. Though his crimes may not be justifiable and were reprehensible, some of the messages of his manifesto and ideas on how technology was affecting modern-day society viewed through a lens all before the internet can be rather chilling. Kaczynski believed that technology would continue to march on without regard to how it would possibly affect humans. And it remains true that we are only now really seeing certain effects of things that have come from technologies such as social media and the rise of AI. The reason I introduced Ted Kaczynski is because he is considered to be the person who was affected the most by this experiment. This is the reason many theorize where the beginnings of his philosophies and ideas of the world would really become concrete. This experiment's sole purpose was to break down its subject and make them question their worldview up to this point. The point was to break you. The name is self-explanatory and unfortunately, scientifically, doesn't go much further than its title. Kaczynski was part of the Harvard humiliation experiments. Henry Murray was conducting another experiment, and he needed subjects. This was his last hurrah, and he wanted to go out with a bang. Henry Murray has had a long career up to this point, coming up with the TAT, or Thematic Appreciation Test. The participant is asked to come up with a story about what is happening in the image. This test was used heavily during the 1930s and onwards, and this is Murray's claim to fame. He would be enlisted by the OSS, or Office of Strategic Services, because of this test. The OSS was the precursor to the CIA. This connection with the CIA and Murray will later only become more important. Murray would be a part of massive amounts of researchers and psychologists that would be brought on by the OSS to develop new ways to test soldiers for breaking points, to ensure they wouldn't give any information if an agent were ever caught in the field and interrogated. This would essentially translate to psychologically trying to break them down as much as they could figure out how to. Much of the work that was done by these psychologists was done not in a normal setting like an office or in the field. The work was getting done in the interrogation room. Reportedly, they would be brought into a room with a one-way window and be psychologically assaulted by being belittled, humiliated, and being positioned in front of a giant white light that would blind them. Murray would help orchestrate these mock interrogations, and from this would stem his final experiments. In 1948, he wrote to the Rockefeller Foundation requesting a grant to come up with a research experiment that would more easily narrow down Navy officer candidates. In 1949, a year later, his grant would be accepted and he would begin the research at Harvard, requesting the help of the young, impressionable undergraduates. 1959, Harvard. You receive an invitation. The forum reads the following: would you be willing to contribute to the solution to certain psychological problems by serving as a subject to be studied in a series of experiments or taking a number of tests about 2 hours a week through the academic year? By the end of the experiment, the subjects would be involved with it for 3 years and over 200 hours apiece. The consent form, just like the other experiments in this video, was more than a little conservative on what it actually disclosed to you. This test would draw all kinds of participants, but Murray and his team were specifically looking for people clinging to either extremes of the social ladder: college students who were burgeoning and successful, and those who tended to stick to themselves and were more reserved. Kaczynski would fall into the latter, and was one of the reasons he would get picked. This would begin the ensuing 3 years that almost all of the participants would call more than unpleasant. The experiment would begin lightly, and would slowly pick up over the time spent with Murray and his team. Every participant was to receive a nickname from Murray as to keep their identity hidden from each other. Kringle, Trump, Hinge. These were some of the names that Murray picked. He was said to be very intuitive on his nicknaming process, and it would reflect the person perfectly. Kaczynski would receive the nickname Lawful. Whether this would be ironic or not would never be disclosed. Murray's first task would be having the subjects write essays about various subjects, almost all of them intimate to a person's identity and psyche. Ultimately, Murray wanted to know everything about you, by self-submission, of course. He wanted to use that knowledge to break you, to make the subject question everything they ever thought as their compass in life. The goal of the experiment was to break you as a person. That was it. There was no scientific objectives set out to prove. There was no real data to collect other than personal thoughts, dreams, and morals. The point of the experiment was solely to humiliate you. This would be achieved typically through a means of fake interrogation. Murray wanted you to walk right into a trap. Of the several students that have spoken about this experiment now, all have discussed the unpleasant nature of the things they endured during the entire event. Many described the following event to be the catalyst and most intense part of the entire process. Kaczynski and the rest of the participants were tasked with being interviewed about very personal thoughts and ideas. They were made to write essays and autobiographies. They would assault them with a barrage of tests that were standard at the time. The Rorschach, the Wyatt finger painting test, the California Psychological Inventory. These would give researchers all the ammunition for the real experiment. After Murray and his team had everything they needed for that specific subject, Murray would announce one week that the subjects would debate another undergraduate on some of the topics the subjects wrote about. This would be a lie. Who was waiting for them when the students would enter the room was a lawyer, someone who is trained in debate, someone whose job is to argue against someone. The students would be no match. Murray and his team led the subjects to a room that was made up to be a mock interrogation room. It had a one-way mirror and 2 chairs with a table that made it look homey, reportedly. The students would sit down on the tables, and the session would begin. I could see shadowy activities going on behind the one-way glass. I had a sensation, somewhat akin to being strapped on the electric chair with those electrodes. There I was under the lights, and with movie cameras and all this experimentation equipment on me. It was a sort of unpleasant experience. I didn't like the room. I didn't like the way the glass was in front of me through which I couldn't see, but I was being watched, and right away that puts one in kind of a unnatural situation. And I noted the big white lights, and again, that heightens the unnatural effect. There was something peculiar about the setup, too. It was supposed to look homey, or look natural. 2 chairs and a little table, but again, that struck me as unnatural before the big piece of glass and the lights. They would be filmed, examined, and completely humiliated. This would be Murray's ultimate goal. After these stressful interviews, Murray would follow up with multiple viewings of the footage he and his team had filmed the view. The subjects were made to comment on the expressions they were making, or perhaps a violent gesture they had made. Murray wanted you to see these replays and go back to that moment. He wanted to continue putting this memory back in your mind. Again, this was the point of the experiment. Murray did little to hide the fact that this was merely a game to him, reportedly telling fellow researchers "Quae bono," which roughly translated to "whom will it benefit?" when asked what he hoped to achieve with the experiment. All under the guise of science, sadly being used again as a scapegoat to put other humans in situations that are of the extreme unethical nature and have no value for research ultimately from the onset. This experiment would slowly subside, and Murray began to give his research team access to the undergraduate students for their own purposes, such as other experiments that had nothing to do with what Murray had disclosed to the subjects. Graduating year for the students, the experiment would come to a close, and by that time, they had given every hope and dream, every piece of history from birth to coming to Harvard. Every piece of information that made up their identity had been given to Murray. What he decided to do with this data may not be very shocking considering everything to this point. Murray would do nothing. Nothing would ever come from this experiment. In 1963, he asked the National Institute of Mental Health for support to finish writing a book based on the data. He would never even start writing it. Other colleagues at the time would wonder sometimes why Murray was engaging in the experiment. A former assistant would go on to reveal to Murray's autobiographer that his real interest was just to see what would happen when people attacked each other. Whatever the reason, Murray would never fully disclose. He was said to be elusive and mysterious by others. After this experiment, he would go on to leave Harvard and actually be investigated for the death of his wife, with many strongly suspecting him to be the murderer after a long string of affairs in his personal life. However, he would be caught up in the late stages of our last experiment as well, one that has been brewing since World War II. 1959, the year Kaczynski would arrive at Harvard, would also be the year that Timothy Leary, a soon-to-be pioneer of the psychedelic movement and large purveyor of LSD, would introduce Henry Murray to the drug. This introduction of the drug was not entirely due to Timothy Leary, but rather a completely different source. One that was interested in seeing what the drug itself could do, the CIA. Our last experiment is by some arguably still happening, and to many, is one of the most terrifying experiences they've ever experienced. Our last experiment is MKUltra. However, this topic is too much to cover in just one piece, so we'll be covering a specific event that exposed much of the MKUltra program itself. Let's dive in. Wouldn't you like to control someone's mind? Some people have been asking this question for centuries. In modern times, one example can be remembered as a feverish attempt at controlling minds for more than just a simple trick. The US government wanted mind control to sway nations, to bring people to their knees, to make you an unwilling agent in a plot you might have never realized you were involved in. MKUltra was this experiment. Operation Paperclip, which was the acquisition of Axis scientists and researchers that we found to be the most useful for future endeavors, that would go on to work for government entities, such as NASA or even the CIA itself. These Axis scientists wouldn't just be put in behind-the-scenes positions either. Werner von Braun would be one of the men we took in and would later be responsible for America's success in the moon landing. These were the very people that had just been experimenting on weapons of destruction, on new ways to torture humans, on ways to deliver death in the most devastating ways and to the most amount of people. Along with acquiring these men, the US government would acquire something else as well. A lot of the research that these scientists were doing, some of it practical. For instance, the hot and cold experiment we discussed earlier during Unit 731. A larger portion, however, was very experimental. Some included brainwashing and mind control. After this acquisition of scientists, the CIA would establish Project Bluebird in 1950. The objective was to study interrogation, mind control, and behavioral techniques to influence people. The project would be renamed to Project Artichoke in 1951. Then it would be changed again in 1953 to the name we know now, MKUltra. This is when they would introduce LSD into the program as a means to control one's mind and change how they might think. This is when the horror would truly begin. Dr. Donald Ewan Cameron, a Canadian psychiatrist working out of Montreal at the Allen Memorial Institute. Allen Memorial was a teaching hospital attached to McGill University, one of the largest Canadian universities. This is where many unethical experiments would take place, all being funded by a CIA shell corporation. During the late 50s, the CIA would fund many famous places, including Harvard, and even cross the border to where our story takes us, into the office and practice of Dr. Cameron. Dr. Cameron had been treating schizophrenia and other mental health issues for some time. He believed in the process of erasing memories or de-patterning. Also was performing a technique called psychic driving. Patients would be made immobilized and sedated and have a message replayed to them for over 16 hours on a tape. Some would hear this message hundreds, even thousands of times, and the process was to play negative messages for up to 10 days and then another 10 days of positive messages. The point of these treatments was to take the patient's mind and try to erase it. After this erasure, Dr. Cameron would attempt to instill more positive mental traits. The success rate of these experimental treatments, I think, speak for themselves. There doesn't seem to be anyone practicing these treatments anymore for good reason. This and many other experimental treatments would grab the attention of the CIA, and after that, it was only a matter of bankrolling more of these experiments. Out of the 56 estimated people to be experimented on in Dr. Cameron's care, only a handful ever sought out more help, sought out answers to the questions that had begun to form over the years. The small amount of people that came forward with questions would soon find out what had happened to them in the small span they had received treatment from Cameron. They unknowingly became wrapped up in and participated in one of the biggest experiments to happen in the 21st century. This would slowly get pieced together over the years, memories slowly forming back together. First, they would have to remember what had happened to them in that office.
For 15 years, I was a high school teacher until I began to remember what had happened. And I too, like many other people, are now on disability and have had to give up that career. I was raised in the small town of Fort Erie, Ontario, and my family was involved in the medical community and the Masonic community and in the military, and the same things have happened to me that I'm sure that you've heard have happened to many other people. I barely survive the amount of pain from headaches in my temples, and I would like an explanation of why this happened, and I want the government to stop what's happening because it's still happening, and to recognize the terrible damage that's been done to us, and that you have changed our lives in so many terrible ways, and I want it to end, and I want an explanation.
As we stated before, Dr. Cameron was famous for his use and practice of psychic driving, being put in a sedated state and having messages played to you over and over again. Cameron would continue this practice, but with new funding. He introduced LSD to this treatment as well. This would really begin to alter people's perceptions and memories. Velma was admitted to Cameron's care, hoping to get help for her mental illness, and was instead taken advantage of. She would be put into a coma-like state and had been electroshocked well beyond the normal degree the treatment was used for the time. Cameron made her ingest LSD before all of these sessions. This would be given typically in a vial with no description on it, containing the odorless and clear liquid drug, hoping the LSD would help de-pattern her mind so that the mental illness she faced could be erased from memory. These treatments were meant to erase and mend the mind. After this, Velma couldn't read, she couldn't write, and would unfortunately never receive anything other than trauma for her help in the experiment. She passed away in 1990. Dr. Mary Morrow, a fellow psychiatrist, went to Cameron for help. She had been suffering from depression lately and wanted to see if Cameron and his treatments could possibly help her. She was betrayed on the professional and patient level. Much like Velma, she would be drugged, shocked, and attempted to be de-patterned. All of this included LSD before the sessions. Her results would be just as disastrous. After the 11 days she spent receiving treatment, she had to be hospitalized for brain anoxia, a lack of oxygen flow to the brain. She lost everything, her position in her career and even her mental state. She unfortunately suffers from prosopagnosia, a condition which makes it nearly impossible to remember people's faces. There are countless more stories. These are just the ones fortunate enough to get an inkling of what was happening to them. to the family members dedicated to finding out why their loved one was worse after what they thought would be a fix for everything. The Society for the Investigation of Human Ecology would later be found out to be a shell company that the CIA was funding. They would be the ones to reach out to Dr. Cameron, asking for him to apply for a grant that he would receive and get a paycheck of $60,000, equivalent to about $500,000 in 2023, all in the name of finding out how to break the human mind and control it. To the CIA, this was all in the name of good, in the name of keeping justice. However, just like the other researchers, scientists, and psychiatrists we've discussed in this video today, they would all be misguided by that belief, believing the research they were doing to be the utmost important work for the human race, or maybe even just the nation they resided in. All of them going down in infamy as the most unethical, disturbing experiments imaginable. MKUltra officially ended in 1964, but it wasn't until a full decade later that the American and Canadian public would find out about what had been happening to some of them unwillingly. For some, the puzzle pieces would begin to fit and lawsuits would begin to form out of this. Other people never putting together that they had been part of a much larger mind control experiment that had gone wrong and left them permanently scarred. Richard Helm, the CIA director at the time, had ordered for all the documents having information that pertained to MKUltra to be burned in 1973. The Church Committee, a U.S. senator-appointed committee formed to investigate the CIA, would launch its investigation just a year later in 1974. This investigation was prompted by an article that would be released by the New York Times. Unknowingly, or perhaps being tipped off, much of the evidence was already burnt. This hampered the investigation, but in the end they were able to find paperwork that linked many of the CIA's shell companies financially to places like Stanford, Harvard, and of course at the Allen Memorial Institute where Dr. Cameron practiced. This experiment really has been gestating, changing, and growing in the background of our last three we have discussed. Its origins stretching from World War II to college and institutions all over North America, to being exposed in the 1970s to the public. Unfortunately, just like the other experiments, not much came from the testing themselves or the researchers or medical professionals themselves. Drug research was well documented on LSD through this period. Mind control was not. No successful cases of ever controlling anyone's mind ever seemed to happen in the span of the experiment. Many argue that the testing is still going on, and some even suggest that some violent events occur through MKUltra programming and are a result of their trigger phrase being spoken, a sleeper agent, if you will. I don't think the true scope of the MKUltra program will ever be truly discovered, but from what we do know, it was extensive, and it was terrifying. This has been some of the most disturbing, unethical experiments ever to take place. Thank you for watching. This has been Plasma Black. Take care of yourself, and see you next time.